Can you start right now?
Okay,
Okay, great, please. And please give her a big hand.
So it's a pleasure to be here after this long and wonderful day, coming on a day earlier that was also long and wonderful. I wanted to be clear about where this talk is coming from and what my argument is to begin with. So I have been working with the UN Human Development Report for about 5 or 6 years. They've taken on the rubric of the Anthropocene. And the other people that I'm talking to in this paper are philosophers, economic historians, and other historians. And the question is growth and degrowth. And so I'm going to be talking about what makes Anthropocene economics different from the way we've thought about economics before. Because what we're getting in so many of the discussions is that the great acceleration or the great growth, as Jacob has taught me to say, is a bad thing, and therefore the answer is degrowth, which is a good thing. Perversely, I am going to argue against this, and the claim I'm going to make is that this is not a way of adequately understanding how that great growth transformed our planet, so that instead of just saying degrowth, what we really need to do is to think about redundancy. So I'm going to argue for redundancy. You can now take the nap we've been longing for some time. So we've looked at these graphs a gazillion times, and I want to emphasize how they trace something marvelous that happened in the mid-20th century. The population grew because we were healthier, women didn't die in childbirth, people had telephones. Apparently that's wonderful for many people. Real GDP grew, we had mobility. These things look terrific. Growth is good. There was a very strong feeling about that. And rather than to disdain the people in the past and think, oh, those fools, we must remember how alluring this was, both to capitalists and to communists, because there was a hope that growth would give us peace after World War II. It would give us justice, because then everybody could live well. And it was the answer to half a century of global war for many people. And I want to emphasize that it is the global nature of growth, not just the Western capitalist nature of growth, that causes the great growth, the great acceleration. Because the Soviet economy, of course, increased very rapidly in the 1950s. Mao was very interested in the Great Leap Forward and killed almost 20 to 40 million people in the process of growing during those years. People wanted growth everywhere around the planet. And it's that connectedness of this idea that is very important. So here's our friend Richard Nixon, who looks better and better in the rearview mirror, although a lot of us didn't like him at the time. And he's talking to Khrushchev about who has the best kitchen gadgets. And apparently the US did, so at that point we won. But we now, of course, know that growth is devastating. And we are seeing it in all sorts of ways, and we've been discussing it for 2 days. So this is just a paper that came out just a few days ago that's a nod to all those water papers we were listening to this morning. It appears that ocean acidification has now passed a safe threshold. This is terrifying. So we know that growth is now devastating. And so it seems to many people that degrowth is the answer. But my point is that degrowth is really a Holocene solution for something that is far more complicated. So my ultimate answer is yes, eventually we need some sort of degrowth, but mostly no, because we have to think about providing for the billions of people who are going to join us on this planet, and also maintaining the structures that feed those people and allow us to continue to have some sort of life, not great lives everywhere, but some sort of life. So I'm going to make this argument against degrowth, but just to give you a little background, the term was coined by one of my favorite philosophers, Andre Gortz, in 1972, and it is now featured in the IPCC and the IPBES, and is also talked about in the United Nations Human Development Report. So this is not just within academic conversations, it is also within policy conversations, and the idea is that we should simply shrink the economy, use less resources, and put well-being ahead of profit, all of which sounds great. I mean, I'm not going to say this is just, these people are terrible, but there's a certain simplicity here that we need to beware of. And I'm going to pick as my punching bag somebody who is way above my weight class. This guy, Saito Kohei. I don't know about your books, but my books do not sell 500,000 copies. Yeah, not even close. And he has become, some of you may know, a global phenomenon advocating Marxist degrowth. And his idea is that, without actually publishing this idea, Marx secretly in his notebooks came up with this idea of degrowth in the very last years of his life. Maybe he did, but it still is not. It's still a Holocene solution for the Anthropocene problems that we face. And Saito is such a cheerful person. I really, it makes me seem, like a bleak, dark antagonist to Mr. Happiness here. So Saito says we can have a clear, bright future from a Marxian perspective. We can restore that elusive unity in the past between humans and nature. I keep wondering where that unity was. Just point me to it. I'd love to see it. We can, if we forego our animalistic wants, whatever those are, I don't know whether that includes sex or food, but give that up and we can enjoy radical abundance. Okay, you go first. And if we end consumerism, we can have a beautiful and easy life, playing guitars, hiking, painting, and not doing very much work. And apparently not asking who's going to make those guitars for us or maintain the hiking trails or anyway. So I've made enough fun of him. You know where I'm going with this. This is a little simple. So we have this Holocene problem, and many of the advocates just say, oh, we'll degrow and all will be well. So what I want to do is point out that despite using the term Anthropocene, Saito doesn't understand what the Anthropocene is. The Holocene dynamic gave us a fairly stable and predictable Earth. Population and our economies relied first on current energy, whether it was fuel or food or whatever, and then we began to rely on past energy, fossil fuels. What has happened now in the Anthropocene is that we have begun to colonize the future. We are drawing down on future resources in order to keep our population going. And we're doing this through the technosphere, which I'll describe a little bit in a minute, but this means that it's very prone to thresholds and tipping points about which we've already talked some today. So Will Steffet, the much missed Will Steffet, who I met first through Bloomsdon Park, has explained that there's no going back to that utopia that Saito is pointing to. That we have essentially two choices in front of us. One is an unmitigated Anthropocene, which is like choosing hell. This is business as usual. This will push us into unpredictable tipping points. Our other choice, by no means playing the guitar and hanging out and hiking all afternoon, is to produce a mitigated Anthropocene, which would take us away from these tipping points into hothouse Earth to something that looks like stabilized Earth, but would still be a very difficult planet to live in, with decreased biodiversity, radically decreased biodiversity, and levels of carbon, methane, nitrous oxide, which our species has never lived with, and temperatures, which our species has never thrived with. So those are our two choices. We don't have the choice of going back to some unity between humans and nature. So degrowth is hard. I understand. Why is degrowth so hard? I think I meant to write so hard to understand. So anyway, I don't know what I meant to write. This was rather late last night. The problem is that we are colonizing the future. And you can see this through these planetary boundary models. I don't know whether they have the same problems that the Great Acceleration model. Yes, I figured they did. But we certainly are drawing down on the resources of the future. And if everyone lived like an American, we would require 5 planet Earths. If you're talking about Dubai or Luxembourg, it's even more. And the really terrifying thing is that everybody relies on that technosphere, even those people living in garbage dumps. It's not as though just those of us, like those of us in this room who are lucky, are living off the technosphere. It is all of us at different levels are dependent on drawing down future resources. And part of this is because of the intensification of the urbanization of human populations. So this is one way of thinking about this, the country overshoot days, which measures when in the year we begin to draw down on future resources. So they can do overall Earth. Oh, it didn't all fit in the slide very well. In 1971, the Earth as a whole went over Earth Overshoot Day in December. By 2023, it was August. That's fast. That's really fast. And the sad thing is that even if you are living in one of the developing countries like Indonesia, you're still drawing down on the future. So this is not just a question of first world versus the rest. So it is the technosphere that allows us to do this. We have a lot of stuff, as many of you will know from that very famous essay now from December 2020, which pointed out that there are 30 trillion tons of human-made stuff supporting our 8 billion plus people. And so this is an emergent system, a system that is now developed transgenerationally, and no one is in control. In fact, what Peter Half tells us is that it is in control of us. It is our master. We are our servants. Because if we let this thing crash or bring it to the ground in some way, although I'm not sure exactly how we would do that, the deaths will be horrendous. So we're both reliant on the technosphere, but ultimately it will kill us. So this is a terrible, terrible conundrum. So what should we do? This is what I'd like to suggest is one of the ways forward, which is to build redundancy on our unpredictable planet. Holocene thinking has given us the tools to live in a predictable world. We can make decisions on the basis of what is likely to happen, what is probabilistic. But in an unpredictable world where there are disasters of various sorts, we've been hearing a lot about those, we can't predict anymore. And so what we need to do, and what some people are already doing, is build up redundancy, to have many systems to do the same thing. Last week I was in Yokohama. Yokohama is building all sorts of redundant energy systems of different kinds, so that should this happen, or a typhoon happen, or a tsunami happen, or an attack on the electrical grid happen, there will be something there. So that's one way to think about it. Japan and other places are very interested in water sources, looking at old wells, figuring out how to have barrels, and not giving up on old systems. One of the places that gave up an old system that they had actually knew worked for them was the city of Bristol in England. A monastery built by a spring above the city had fed Bristol with fresh water for a long, long time. And then naturally in the 20th century it built a more modern system. And then during the unpleasantness of World War II, the Germans bombed the modern system, and Bristol started relying on the old medieval system for its water supply. But what did they do with classic modernist thinking immediately after the war? Get rid of the old medieval system. Now they were going to have a spanking new system. That's the kind of thinking we need to avoid. And in fact, redundancy relies on inefficiencies. We have been training ourselves to think about how to build efficient systems. Redundancy says multiple systems. That's going to be more expensive. That's going to require more work. That's not going to allow us to play the guitar all afternoon. So I want to close with a little example from Japan, which is, as some of you will know, what I'm supposed to be working on, although I seem to be working on the Anthropocene far more. And that is to look at the closed system of Tokugawa, Japan, which is closed in the sense, and it's only a partial closure, in the sense of allowing people to leave and come back. You couldn't do that as a Japanese person under the Tokugawa system, nor was there a lot of trade, although there was certainly some trade with China through Nagasaki. So it's not exactly a closed system, but it gives us something of a template for thinking about this problem. Some people have romanticized Tokugawa, Japan. I don't feel romantic about Tokugawa, Japan particularly, but it did get some things right, and some interesting things right. I would say 250 years of peace ain't bad. That would be amazing if we would manage to do that. They built this peace on the basis not of autocracy, but of a strong but decentralized control, so that various domains had a fair amount of autonomy. And very crucially, the elite were removed from the villages, unlike medieval and early modern Europe, so that villagers could get on with the lives they had there. And one of the things they did in the 18th century was to stabilize their population. Another very curious thing. In the old days, meaning from about the 1920s on, when there were a lot of good leftist Marxists, the analysis was proof of oppression, oh my gosh, these people were dying. But it turns out that in fact, small villages and a change in the inheritance laws became very aware of the limits of their ability to grow. So you would only have one child married. You wouldn't have all your children married. You would actually aim for a rather reduced family, maybe 2 or 3. You wouldn't have 15 kids because growing rice in this way, you didn't need to send the boys off with the goats up in the mountains or whatever. So these small villages would prepare for unpredictability with a lot of different kinds of crops. They had to pay their taxes in rice, but they would grow more crops. There was greater equality. There was certainly not equality in these villages, don't get me wrong, but they certainly had to organize as communities to manage these tight feedback loops, to make sure they had well-being. But nevertheless, because they were clever, as all human beings are clever, they grew. They decided, we can specialize. We can begin to do what's really good in our village and buy our rice from the village over and pay our taxes in that. And eventually, even in Japan, the development of that circular economy doesn't work, or doesn't quite work, although they certainly, through what is called the Industrious Revolution, managed to use their resources with great economy. I'm not saying that this was a disaster, but I'm just saying human beings have a tendency to grow. There's no perfection back in the past. There's no utopia back in the past. We can't, this was not a unity between humans and nature. Eventually, Japanese people were going up into Hokkaido, or what was known then as Ezo, the northernmost island, which wasn't even fully under Japanese control, to do lumbering. And they began to go out and fish more and more and in fact, more and more cleverly, so they were wiping out fish populations because they needed to dry the fish for fertilizing the fields. So this is by no means a green utopia, but at least they managed for 250 years. I don't know whether you believe you can live forever like President Putin, but if we are still around 250 years from now, if we've managed to do that well, then that would be pretty good. But there are people now who are trying to build redundancy. And I'll give you two brief examples before I close. One is Edward Norfolk. He happens to be the Duke of Norfolk, and he happens to have fairly deep pockets. He decided he really wanted to shoot not red partridges, but gray partridges. It turns out it's very difficult to reconstruct an environment that will support a bird that was once ubiquitous. So it took 20 years, many specialists, to build up a kind of replenished, but not exactly the same, ecosystem that would allow the Duke to shoot these birds, which he does about one or two days a year. The investment for return is astounding, but anyway. So it's an example of somebody how hard it is to build up resilience. This is perhaps more in our wheelhouse. I'm from Appalachia, I'm from the mountains in Virginia. I'm very interested in the work that's being done there to try to build small, sustainable, agricultural projects, including, this is Jason von Kundra, who's a friend, who's taken up the challenge of a book written in the 19th century, which is 10 acres is enough, about a New Jersey farm. Jason is got 10 acres, and the variety of plants that he builds there, he grows there, are giving him a chance to make something of a living, $20,000, $25,000 a year, but he's also guarded against all the unpredictability of our changing climate, including Hurricane Helene that swept through this area. So he wasn't wiped out. If he'd been more efficient and had only grown one crop, he would have had a complete loss. So what I've suggested in this talk is that degrowth ultimately is necessary, but degrowth is dangerous. It simply cannot be an easy mantra. The next point is that the technosphere is necessary. We are all reliant on it, but it is also ultimately lethal. Building redundancy will take lots of economic investment, and investing is going to stoke some forms of economic growth. We're going to need to get capital invested in ways to help us even build local redundancies. So efficiency is not necessarily our friend. We actually have to start thinking about inefficiency. And we have to relearn the old skills of community, which won't be easy to do, because modernity gave us the freedoms of mobility and choice, which all of us exemplify here. Very few of us live right in our hometowns and always have, building those community skills, which will allow people to make the sacrifices for redundancy. So I think we've got to think very hard about the political aims now of our new world. And we're going to have to support governments and scientific work while recognizing their limited power in a much more unpredictable planet. So thank you very, very much. And
thank you so much for the insightful talk. And I learned a lot, and I want to invite some questions, comments.
Thank you for the talk, Julia. I have a comment and then another comment which can be rephrased as a question. The first comment is I couldn't agree more on the degrowth idea being naive, because it's somehow built on the idea that time reversibility. It's like, you know, you play a movie backwards, and we know from physics, this is mostly the case, but then there's entropy. So we'll know when the movie plays backward if the disorder also vanishes. If you take a movie of us having dinner and the table is clean after that when we leave the room, then something is wrong. So the CO2, and that's our problem. We are creating entropy. We're spreading our fossil fuels in form of carbon dioxide. We put the microplastics in the ocean. That's going to be there, even if we have the number of people, if we have de-industrialized. So that's the naive thing about it, that the mess stays, right? Even if we do everything else in reverse. The other question regards your idea of redundancy, which I totally share. I think to make us more resilient, we have to be redundant. There are many historical examples, but then you said two things. You said, like, okay, that probably means more work, less playing guitar, and you mentioned the economic aspect. Isn't there something missing in this analysis? Because if we don't find other modes of reduction, then redundancy means, you mentioned like a redundant energy system. I put a generator. That means I expend extra energy, I have more material flows, I have to reserve the rooms, I have land use changes. If we keep doing this, we create a feedback, and most of the redundant systems will just accelerate the thing again. So it cannot be the ultimate solution. That's the question. Or the comment.
I mean, I think that's absolutely right. And the problem is how very difficult it is to figure out what is good to build and what is not. And the kind of local planning, if we're going to keep this in democratic hands, the kind of local planning and built-in inefficiencies are going to be really dangerous. I agree. You know, again, I'm not proposing a utopia, but we can't do business as usual. So I mean, you know, this is obviously something that we all need to keep talking about. And I think this is one of those things that's going to be quite different in different areas, because as people learn to respond to the particular dangers and unpredictabilities in their areas, they're going to have to think about that. So, yes.
Thank you very much. So, first of all, I am very, very glad to find out that your idea about Saito's argument is very similar to me. So I'm so pleased. But in my mind, I have contradictory ideas in my mind actually. So I think Degrowth is kind of the reaction against some growing movement. And also, especially when we think about the politics, especially politics in America and Korea also, and other European also too. So the politics is going to move more right wings, radical right wing. When I say that, so how do you think about the reality of the politics, and is it really how can I say? And also when I think about redundancy, of course I agree with your idea, and also I think that we need more time and space for the redundancy, but at the same time, I think the trend, the ongoing trend is quite opposite to redundancy. So how can we find some possibilities? So that's my question.
Thank you so much for your comments. I'm delighted by your solidarity on Saito. I've got a paper coming out in environmental history with a special forum on degrowth. And apparently I was the odd person out. And they said, how can you attack Saito? You know, he should be allowed to respond. I'm thinking, he's a big elephant here. He's not even going to feel my pinprick. But it's amazing how many people have decided, he's sort of our answer. So thank you for that. The other thing is about the nature of our jobs as intellectuals and academics. Do I think there are real dangers and difficulties in putting any of these ideas forward? Of course I do. I think one of the biggest and most frightening things is what you alluded to about the relationship between democracy and growth. We have not experienced democratic society, mass societies, modern democratic mass societies that really worked without the promise of growth. And if we decide that we can't grow anymore, what's that going to do to our politics? And I think that's a real challenge. I don't think it does any good to sweep it under the rug. I think we need to face it head on. But I have sources of hope, including Jason von Kundra, who I showed you with his bean plants. And also a lot of the movements I'm seeing amongst people more your age than mine, who are engaged in the sharing economy, for instance, who are interested in doing something other than corporate jobs. And I've got a former student who wrote to me and said she got out of Bank America and is now working with a small community. And it's like, okay, maybe we do it this way, just small incremental steps. And I think one of the really important things is we have, as intellectuals and academics, a floor to speak to policymakers and to others. And I think we need to speak clearly. I think Joachim is absolutely right, growth, degrowth, neither of those we need redundancy. There's a kind of reductiveness there, absolutely. But when I'm in the room with people who are making policy, I don't go on and on about Tokugawa Japan. I try to make it as clear as possible so they can see these categories. These are smart people with only a little bit of time, And I think it behooves us to learn to speak to them directly. And that means we speak differently amongst ourselves than we do to others. But I think that's a help too. Thank you.
Yeah, I also have to simply say I love your talk. It's a wonderful talk, and I side with you also against Saito.
We've got a team.
I think he's a false prophet, to put it shortly. You know, I happen to know his thesis advisor. He wrote a very nice doctoral dissertation on Marx and Liebig, you know, discovering new aspects of Marx. That's helpful. But the degrowth communism is, just as you said, just naive and ignorant of the Anthropocene. So that's, I want to state that very, very clearly. I also side with Jochen that redundancy, we may not be able simply to afford redundancy, but I would suggest another concept under which you can, in which you can frame your examples. They fit very well, and that's the capacity for regeneration. And you know, some of these systems that you showed, and the Bristol is a good example, but the Appalachian example works also well. Here you see systems, local systems, that have the capacity for regeneration. This is, you know, we hope that we won't need it to the extent, you know, you mentioned World War II situation of emergency, in which we have to rely on this capacity. Basically, also we can learn here from biology, because biological systems, you know, they sometimes have redundancy, but certainly, think of something like stem cells or so, they have a capacity for regeneration, and that's what we have to learn. And my last remark concerns growth. I think, you know, if you consider the energy question, there is still some room for growth. We need to undergo a global energy transformation to renewable energy. Renewable energy, and this is very often misunderstood, and it has something to do with the Saito type of misunderstanding, which is not a Marxist position, but it's a very general position, is that energy is very often treated as a scarce commodity. It's not. If we pass over to sustainable, to renewable energies, there is a lot of there. I mean, the constraints are the material conditions, as we know. If we want to electrify mobility, for instance, we need a lot of renewable energy. And so there are, in other words, you know, directions still of growth, but just as you showed in the graph from Will Steffen, it needs to be a steered growth. It can no longer be a blind growth. It needs to be directed. You know, so we don't have, and I totally agree, let's exclude the dichotomies between growth and degrowth. But a kind of, you know, more conscious, more intelligent development can offer solution. I'm not claiming that we're getting there, but at least we should show and argue for the possibility to shape the growth that we want and that we need for sustainability. Thank you for your talk.
So, yet again, we are having a lot of shared ideas. But I wanted to push back a little bit on, I mean, regeneration is an interesting word here. I think sometimes there is the idea that we pull out, human beings pull out of an area, nature will come back.
That's not good.
Yeah, and I think that this rewilding idea is not going to get us there. We've changed too much. The climate has changed, the biosphere, you know, the ecosystems have changed too much. So, I mean, I think regeneration is a good word, but we need to define it more precisely.
And it was not just referring to natural systems. It was referring to anthropocenic communities of humans and other species.
Yes, okay. Yeah, no, I mean, it's not that I'm rejecting the word, it just needs to be. The last point about more energy is an interesting one. Obviously, they're saying we need 2 billion, we're going to have 2 billion more people on this planet. This is a problem. I'm worried about a lot of the so-called green energy that is going online because of its material demands and the way it's often framed without looking at the waste products, you know, which I'm sure you agree with. So again, you're talking about a more mindful way of managing our way to some sort of restabilizing the Earth system, and I think unfortunately we agree, which prevents us from doing arm wrestling. So, yeah.
Well, thank you, Julia. And the Saitos book has been translated into Korean, and with much expectations, I read it in my class with undergraduate students, and students got interested in some of the ideas because it's a very friendly introduction to Marxism, but I absolutely agree that he didn't really get the gist of the Anthropocene messages, and so that I a bit disappointed. This is just a sharing comment. One of the very original thesis that you made, not today, but in other articles, is that humans recognize at some point, at the point of the Anthropocene, that they obtained Earth system agency, right? And it's kind of stumbled upon a great power as a collective, as a species. Although it can be criticized in a number of ways, but that's an important point. And I think that's a very useful term to describe how the humans as a whole, whether it's rich or poor, and then it's the Earth system agency. But your sort of suggestion here is very old-style human community-based solutions to the problems caused by that Earth system agency. So the problems are a real agency, and then solutions are like more individual and community based. And so I was wondering,
The relationship between those two agencies.
yeah, between the two, and then would there be, and I don't know whether Jongshik is here. The Chinese sort of ecological civilization is, I don't know, this is a large scale cultural changes towards fascists. I mean, it's not waste. I mean, it has to be dealt with. And then also all kinds of energy saving the efforts, which is way better than other Western countries. So Tokugawa culture is as one example of redundancy and in building, and then there is another sort of the alternative civilization project. So again, I have a sort of a tone between the two ways, and so. And then also redundancy is a good one, and then whether it's a really different from resilience building or the old, but there is a lot of, it's not a question, but I don't know whether you can help me in coping with a number of ideas.
Yeah, that was a very rich comment. I'm only going to pick out one bit of it, which is Earth system agency and the kind of things I'm talking about in this talk. The problem with Earth system agency is that it's a transgenerational agency. It's also beyond political control. Mm-hmm. It's not something that we have a lot of ways of intervening in. And I'm taking the idea from Tony Barnowski and other people who've talked about, is it enough to just add up local changes to make the Anthropocene change? And they argue that it is not, that there's something beyond with this collective global force. And that force is not something that is amenable to our institutional or political control. What we can do is figure out how to create smaller communities, because politics can happen there. or even national communities, as you're suggesting, although I hesitate to hold up China as an example to us all. So what I'm looking for is something where we can actually have an intervention. I'm not sure that I think Peter Hack is right, the technosphere and the Earth system agency that drives the technosphere is really not amenable to our current capacities to control it. So I think we should let Jan have a chance.
A great discussion, and I think now let's move on to next talk. It will be given by Professor Emeritus Jan Zalasi on the economy of Anthropocene.